Next question is from Blower18. How can you know how good your muscle building genes are? Wrist, ankle, and neck measurements? And what would be good measurements as opposed to bad?
Okay, there's so many.
I've heard of this now. Like how accurate?
Okay, so they did some, and I can't remember the site, but they did some calculations of what they believe to be some of the best natural bodybuilders of all time, and what their top measurements were, and then they correlated them to their wrist, ankle, I think wrist and ankle measurement, or wrist to ankle and waist, or something like that.
Too, yeah.
And then they said, okay, this is based off of these people, this would be your upper genetic limit to how much muscle you could build. Now, here's why that's super general. There's so many factors that go into your ability to build muscle. For example, I'll give you one example, right? So one might say your testosterone level. It might play a role in how much muscle you can build. Well, they
play a role?
Well, they just did a study. That's why I said that. It does play a role, but here's why it's not that easy, okay? They just did a study that showed that testosterone levels didn't play that big of a role in how much muscle two groups of men built. What played a bigger role was androgen receptor density. The androgen receptors are what testosterone attached to. So in other words, if you have 600, if your testosterone measures at 600, but you have incredible androgen density.
You got nowhere to park them.
Well, no, you have great androgen density, and someone else has 900 testosterone, but their androgen density is terrible. The 600 might actually be more impactful on muscle building. So there's hormone levels, there's androgen density, there's muscle fiber breakdown and density. There's myostatin. Myostatin's a thing that we learned about over the last 10 years that controls muscle, and you turn that switch off and the body just builds tons of muscle. There's muscle, belly length, and there's so many factors. It's very. I mean, could I look at someone just without working out and say that they probably can build
predictive with it?
Yeah, somewhat, but sometimes I can't. Like I've known people who you'd look at and you'd think, oh, that's an ectomorph. I've known this in gyms, and then they work out and they just build muscle so easily. And you're like, whoa, I wouldn't have predicted
I just feel like this is always the case with the fitness industry, is trying to catalog all of this and try and simplify everything, so you could basically you could have these general standards. So where do I fit? And then that way you can get marketed to and kind of shuttled into products or different type of training methods or nutrition. And they've done this with somatotypes, and they've done kind of generalizations that people sort of identify and relate with. And so it's like, something that kind of seems like it's logical, but again, these are so generalized that there's no way you can be like that accurate when you're predicting these.
Well, there's so many variables, right? There's so many variables with that. But in my experience, I would say that a majority of my clients that had big wrist, big ankles, big bones, basically is what you're big boned, had an easier time building muscle, but a harder time burning body fat. And the same is true on the other end, right? So my clients that had really small wrists, really small ankles, tend to have a harder time building muscle, but had an easier time burning fat. Now, there's always an exception to the rule on both sides of that. There's many other variables that trump that, like your testosterone talk, your discipline. How about your behaviors and discipline too? How about somebody who doesn't have as much potential to build muscle, so they had to build more work ethic and discipline around nutrition, and because of that, they have a better lifestyle and habits and now see more results. So there's always something to counter that argument, but generally speaking, and it's a total overgeneralization, I do think that most of my clients that were big boned had a harder time burning body fat than like my quote unquote ectomorph type of clients.
Yeah, and then you also have the question about measurements. What are good measurements? I mean, do you care what the tape measure says, or do you care about how you look? Like a really lean 16-inch arm on a guy is natural, right? Is impressive to most people. Most people, if you saw a man with a lean, muscular 16-inch arm, that would look more impressive than a guy with an 18-inch arm whose body fat is, 18% body fat, right? Well, it just doesn't look as good. So that's one of those things as well. Now, I can't answer and say, what would be considered like really muscular lean. For most, and this is just from my experience of reading, for years and years about lifters and this and that. For men, if you're natural and you get your arms up to 17 or 18 inches, relatively lean. That's a big ass arm. That's a very big arm. natural. The 20 inchers, that's usually comes from super genetics and anabolic steroids. But again, I mean, it's so different from person to person. And getting lean, I've done this. I've lost 15 pounds, worked out, and everybody comes up to me and says, "Oh my gosh, how did you gain so much muscle?" And I didn't. The difference is I look like I gained a bunch of muscle because I'm so much leaner.
Exactly. Each pose the pros and cons, right? So each side has, like, if you are a bigger bone, your arms may naturally look bigger or put on muscle easier, but like, I mean, my wrist and ankles are like a 13-year-old girl. So I have like these tiny little petite freaking wrists and
they're dainty.
These dainty ankles, right? Now the benefit of that though is like when all the years of building muscle and working towards that, and then when I get on physique, when I was competing, man, it looked way more pronounced. I have this tiny little waist because that's my bone structure. I have a very small waist. I have tiny wrists. So the muscle that I did put on it looks more pronounced because it's more exaggerated than the guy that had the boxier square waist and the thicker wrist and he may even have more muscle, but when you look at it and we present it on stage, I look better for those reasons. So, they all have their pros and cons.
Yeah,
I think getting hung up on, is it easier for me or harder for me, or is it better to have this or that?
There was an old body, but this is like from back in the day. I'd say in this is probably the 1930s. There was a standard for balance that they used, and they used to say that your arm, and they actually used to do this to see if their body was balanced. Your arm, your neck, and your calf measurement need to be the same. If your arm, neck, and calf measurement are the same, then back to those standards back then, you are balanced. You have a balanced physique. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.